Thank you for joining us for the guest lecture. We have our special guest from Austria, from Boku University. She is Rebecca Hutnawatni, PhD. She is affiliated in the Institute of Soil Research, Boku University. Today, she will have the presentation or the lecture about the soil functions for agriculture. We have around 40 minutes for the presentation and then around 20 minutes for the discussion. Please, if you have any questions, so don't hesitate to ask directly to Rebecca. For Rebecca, time is yours.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me and for inviting me for this lecture. I'd like to point out I've put the slides for the lecture in the chat, so you can just download them from there. And today I'm going to talk about soil functions in agriculture. And first of all, I really want us to think a bit about what is the soil. Is the earth skin, animal, mineral, or vegetable? Did we have life before we had soil? What's the role of the soil in the ecosystem? And is there life without soil? Just have a quick think about that. Did the slide change on your view? Just to check, Kiki.
Yeah, sorry.
Did the slide change? It's on the second
Yes.
slide. Okay,
Yes, now
perfect.
is the second slide.
Okay, that's perfect. So it's sometimes we don't really think about these things, and often we'll talk about Mars and stuff, and Mars soil and Martian soil. And I don't think there's really Martian. I don't think there is a Martian soil. I think there's Martian dust. So yeah, really, one of the things we need to think about is what is a soil. Wait, so I'm just trying to pull my mouse is having. I've got two screens, so it's always a bit tricky. Okay. So what are the main soil functions? The main soil functions are that soil's a medium for plant growth, food, fiber, and fuel, especially, different fuels, I mean, obviously, and different fibers, climate regulation and carbon sequestration, nutrient delivery. The organic matter in soil delivers a lot of nutrients or delivers most of the nutrients to the plant apart from fertilizer. Water regulation and purification, and also the soil is a vast habitat for biodiversity. The soil is also, it's very much it's a very difficult medium because it's very much a physical, a biological, and a chemical sort of environment. We have the texture, we have the structure. So the texture being whether it's sand, silt, or clay, the structure being whether we have aggregation, and the soil strength being how sort of like bouncy is the soil, how does that soil sort of react to things like ploughing, etc. Then we have the biological functions, or the biological part, which is really what drives all the processes in the soil. So we have fungi, we have bacteria, we have macrofauna, we have viruses, and we have roots. And the biological side, interestingly, is far more reactive than the chemical side. In the chemical side, we have solutes, we have organic matter breakdown, we have the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, and the P cycle. But those sort of like those chemical reactions that are actually, or the purely chemical reactions in soil, are much, much slower than the biological reactions. In fact, because the biology produces enzymes, the enzymes in the soil can accelerate the reactions in the soil so much faster than any of the chemical reactions. And the sort of like orders of magnitude we're thinking of are like, if you're a human being standing on the earth, that's the speed of the reaction if it's a chemical reaction. But if the speed of the reaction is all the way to the moon, if it's facilitated by, or could be all the way to the moon if it's facilitated by enzymes. So enzymes really speed up the processes, and only only things like fungi and bacteria actually produce those enzymes. So that's what we have to think about. So we know that all the processes such as mineralization, the breakdown of organic matter into inorganic material, is driven by those enzymes and driven by those biological processes. So, sorry, I've realized I'm not. Uh, wait a second. So sorry, I hadn't that slide should have been before. Make sure I keep up, Kiki. so, so the soil, what is the soil? Well, the soil is mainly, it's quite a lot of it's air actually, and quite a lot of it's water, and only about sort of like about 50% of it is actually soil. A lot of that is organic, and of that can be really, it really depends, depending on the soil. That can be organic matter. In most soils, it ranges from 1 to 8%. In peat soils, that can really go up to like almost 100%. And usually in a soil, we would say we have a mineral fraction. Usually most soils have a mineral fraction. That's a weathered fraction, which is around about, around about 46%, but it takes up quite a lot of the volume. The organic fraction is both a dead fraction, so about 95% of that organic fraction is actually dead, and about 5% is alive. So about 5% is like the microbial biomass. So again, that's the bacteria, the archaea, the fungi, all that stuff we can't see with the naked eye, basically. I have to remember to go here, and then I have to go here. Oh, yeah. Okay. So the soil is always made up. I'm just giving a very basic sort of like rundown so that we can all be on the same page. The soil is made up of sand, which is that lovely crunchy stuff. If you pick up a soil and you can hear it, if you rub it between your fingers and you can hear it going, then obviously that's a sandy soil. If you, so that's usually, they're really quite big grains, sand. I always think of sand grains. If you think of those balls you sit on in the office sometimes, those big inflatable balls in the office that often use like yoga balls, that's the sand fraction is usually, I think of it as that big if I'm thinking about it. So they're sort of 2 to 0.5 millimeters, just relatively, I'm thinking. And then the silt soil, we know the silt, if we rub it on our hands, we can see it's very sort of shiny, and we can always tell the silt. It's always got a bit of a glitter. It's a bit glittery, and it's a bit smaller. It's 0.05 to 0.002 millimeters. It's got very high it's got a medium to high organic matter content. It's got a fairly low cation exchange capacity, and it has fairly low aeration. But it's all right. It's fairly medium aeration. Sand, on the other hand, I mean, has got very low cation exchange capacity because it's so big. It has very low surface area. And clay, on the other hand, clays are tiny. So I'll show you a picture in a minute of what I was trying to think of. Clays are tiny. The clays are made up of these lamellae, loads and lots of lamellae, a bit like a book, with many, many pages. That's the lamellae of the clay. And each of those pages is covered in negative charge. And those negative charges mean that it's got very high cation exchange capacity, so they hold minerals, and they hold cations very well, things like potassium or ammonium, etc. Clays are incredibly, as I say, usually very small particles, so they have a very high water holding capacity. They also have a really high organic matter content, usually, or medium to high organic matter content, because the organic matter actually gets stuck between those clay pages, basically. They're also cation exchange capacity is very high because of this negative charge, etc. So they're really very amazing. You can usually tell a clay if you have a clay, you roll it in your hand, and you can make a sausage out of it. It usually means it's a clay. If you can really make the little sausage into a little round ring, then it's definitely a clay. So they're all the things that we can tell. So we can go out into the field and we can fairly easily, once we get our hands wet and we get the soil dirty, we can fairly quickly tell what type of soil a soil is. Obviously, a soil is best when it's all a mixture of all three functions, because then it would have good drainage, it would have good cation exchange capacity. That means it will hold all the nutrients, and it will have good aeration. So what we're looking for is usually looking for a good mixture of all three. So here, as I say, this is where, oh yeah, it's just here it hasn't. Sorry, finding my, okay. So as I say, if I think of a sand, if you're trying to imagine sand as that big ball in the that big ball in the office that you sit on, that's usually the size. And then the size of the clay, when you think about that size differential, the clay particle is usually about the size of a ball bearing or a little marble. Yeah, it's usually very, very small. Ball bearing, do you understand that term? Like those small spheres you get in your bicycle. Um, and a silt particle is a little bit bigger. It's about the size of a tennis ball. A medium sand is usually around about the size of a sort of like a basketball, and a fine sand would be about the size of a volleyball or something. So, but if you think of it, that's the differential in size. So obviously a clay particle, if you've got a teaspoon of clay particles, they've obviously got a much higher surface area. And we can see this in the graph here, that clay particles, I mean, really is exponential increase in the surface area of the clay particles. And that's why that they're so important in the soil, clay particles, because they can, because of that high surface area, obviously we only have those negative charges on the surfaces. And that means that they really make a huge difference in terms of reactivity, and they make a huge difference in how many or how much negative positive charge they can hold. And the more positive charge that the soil can usually hold, especially in places like in Indonesia, for example, where you've got so much rain and you have so much rain, the soil's ability to hold the nutrients in the soil is really, really important. But it's also a thing about the water. The soil's ability to hold the water is really important. So if you think if you had a cage full of really big sand particles, that the water would just flow through the soil very, very quickly. It drains really quickly and very strongly. But because of the size of the clay particles, because they're so small and there's very strong surface tension between them, that force that makes a bubble, that means that the water is held by the soil. It's held really strongly by the soil. So it's not only the chemical, here we see the chemical sort of action, but also the physical action that are happening due to the strong surface tension of the clays. They tend to hold more water in the soil against the gravity, because usually the gravity would be pulling the water down. Yeah. And the third thing about the clays, because of those lamellae, as I said before, bacteria and fungi can sort of be protected within those lamellae, within the clay particles. So the bacteria and the fungi sort of get in there. But things like nematodes, because they're too big, if you think about a nematode, it's too big to get in there and start grazing. So we also, in clay particles, we tend to get a build-up of organic matter in there. And organic matter also has a very negative charge. So it also has a very high cation exchange capacity. So the potassium, the magnesium, the calcium, and the H ions can all stick onto those particles. Yeah. So that's the sort of fundamentals of the soil, sort of like really of the soil, basically. So what we think about the medium for plant growth, one of the soil functions. So what percentage of the food comes from soil? Well, about 95% of global production is directly related or indirectly related to soil. There's only about 5% from aquaculture or sea fishing, etc., and from things that are grown on false medium such as rock, wool, or perlite. Really large percentage of agricultural land is irrigated. About 20% of the land is irrigated, and about 80% is rain-fed. But actually, 40% of the sort of crop production comes from that irrigated land. I mean, and we know why that is we never have the rain when we want it. It's always in the wrong time, and we need to irrigate the land. And we see in most of the hot countries where the sun shines high enough for the plants to grow well, then they're usually also dry, and so therefore we need to irrigate. And what is the total land mass of agriculture in the world? It's about 38% of the total land area is used for agriculture. It's about 5 billion hectares, and about a third of that is for cropland. But interestingly enough, about 2/3 of that is for meadows or for livestock. So it's really quite a huge number. So actually, 2/3 of the land is probably grassland.
Disuruh kalau nanti nggak bisa presensi kalian.
Is that a question or is somebody just...
No,
Should I carry on?
Yeah, you can continue.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. I did it again. So sorry, I did it again. You should tell me. Sorry. So you can just have a read through that just quickly. And just to think about the soil as a medium for plant growth, actually the soil acts as an anchor for the plant growth. But usually most of the root material is usually within about, I would say we go back to this Pareto's rule, within about the top 20 centimeters of the soil, there's usually about the 80% of the roots. The roots that are usually lower down are more for anchorage and for water uptake in times of stress. But we've done a lot of studies where we've listed, this is barley, for example. I don't know why it's not up there. This is barley, for example, and 80% of the roots were definitely in the top 20 centimeters. And this makes sense because this is where all the nutrients are. Usually, if you take a soil profile, you can very quickly see that the most of the nutrients are in the top part of that profile because it's usually a darker color, meaning there's more organic matter there. And the more organic matter there is in the soil, the more mineralization there will be, the more delivery of inorganic nutrients to the plant. So the plant will sort of put the resources into that top sort of part of the soil so it can take up all the nutrients and the water, as well as the water is in that top part of the soil. So, but next part we're going to talk about is carbon sequestration. Soils are the largest near-surface reservoir of terrestrial carbon. In fact, soils have more carbon in them than the above-ground biomass, 2/3. 75%, so 2/3 is 3/4 is stored in the soil. And the soil carbon exchanges, so the amount of emissions and drawdown of carbon is 10 times greater than that of all the human emissions of CO2. So that cycle is far greater than what we're emitting with CO2. However, we have a big influence on it because we are emitting more CO2. I mean, obviously, with global warming or with sort of like with vehicles and burning of fossil fuels, we're emitting more CO2, and that's pushing the global temperature up. But also the problem is that's also pushing the rate of decomposition, so the rate of breakdown of carbon from the soil. And so more and more CO2 is released from soils every year because they're just that bit warmer. So that's one of the problems. And, oh, sorry, I should put, so the total, as you know, I mean, the carbon storage as on a global basis or on an Earth basis, it really depends on the balance between the production, so photosynthesis, how much the plants can produce, and the decomposition, how quickly the plants decompose. And the trouble is with decomposition is we want decomposition in some ways, because when we have decomposition of plant material, that also releases nutrients and is really good for the plants because it does release nutrients. But we also want a storage of carbon. We want to store that carbon in soil so that we don't so that we can offset the global release of anthropogenic carbon dioxide. However, with soils, it's always really very difficult to actually store carbon. We've been working for many years to try and increase the storage of carbon because there's so many other benefits of storing carbon in soils. The storage of carbon, one of the motivations for this storage of carbon is if we, for example, increased the global percentage of carbon by 0.4% or 4 per mil, we could offset if we did it on all soils every year. This was done at COP28. This is a very sort of strong ambition, but a fairly realistic one. If we could increase all the soils by 0.4% carbon per year globally in the top sort of 1 meter, we could actually abate or negate the emissions from the global CO2 fossil fuels. And this has been sort of like a mission of the EU for many years now. So last year, or in the last 5 years, we've had a number of projects called EJP Soil, where we were looking into this. And this is also what the beauty of this sort of motivation is. In many countries where the soils are really poor, actually increasing soil carbon is a really good strategy because it's a win-win for everybody. It reduces increasing the soil, organic matter in the soil is a win-win strategy for everybody because it increases the crop production, it increases the drainage of the soils, etc., but it draws down carbon. It draws down carbon into the soil, and so it can abate the emissions. So we should really be supporting these types of initiative because it's win for the farmer, because they should be able to get better crop production. They get better if their soils have higher organic matter. They're usually more productive, and we'll see this in the lecture. What determines the soil organic matter? Well, the vegetative growth, obviously, the more vegetative growth you have, the greater of the inputs of the carbon. Also, the carbon C to N ratio will have a big influence. Usually, though, we take most of the top above ground biomass away from in agriculture. And so really it's usually only the root fractions. And we'll talk a bit about this at the end. I mean, now what we're saying is we always need to have cover on a piece of land. These are the ways that we can increase carbon. We don't, in the soils, we don't want to have fallow periods. We always want to have very, the ground is always covered. The other thing is that we can increase inputs of carbon. We can grow plants the whole year round. In Austria, that's a bit more tricky than maybe in Indonesia. And then we have things like we have no-till, where we don't actually take off all the residues from the sites. Usually we have like if we have an agricultural crop, we'll have a sort of like a valuable part of that crop, which is like the grain, and then there'll be residues like the straw, etc., that we can theoretically leave in the field, and that could also be a supply of carbon. However, what we're finding more and more is actually the root carbon inputs and the carbon inputs from below ground are almost more important than those residue carbon inputs from above ground. So it's pushing more towards the root carbon. They're pushing more to root carbon management strategies. The topography, the soil at the bottom of the slopes generally have higher carbon. This is usually basically based on the fact that the clay particles, because they're small and they're light, they flow very easily. There's Stokes' law, for example, and they collect when it rains. They're easily dissoluted, and when it rains, they're easily transported to the bottom of the slope. So you'll often find this. You'll see clay particles at the bottom of the slope. Climate in areas where the rainfall is really, really high. And in areas of lower temperature, we tend to get accumulation. Even if growth isn't very high, we tend to get accumulation of carbon because the rates of breakdown, because of things like enzymatic processes being much slower in low temperatures, the rates of breakdown are actually much slower than the rates of production. There's like a disconnect. Soil type is a really massive impact as well. So as I was saying before, the lamellae, the clays, etc., the soil organic carbon can get sort of stuck between those layers, and therefore if you have a higher clay content, you usually have a much higher soil organic carbon content. And then soil pH, if you have very low soil pH or very high soil pH, those soil pHs aren't very good for the enzymes to work. And therefore, those enzymes can't break down that carbon so well. So you basically don't get high rates of mineralization. So usually low pH and high pH soils aren't particularly good for growing agriculture, but they tend to build up soil organic carbon because of the low pH. The only other problem is when you have low or high pH, you also don't have that much vegetative growth because there isn't that many nutrients. So what you want is really you want this balance between good vegetative growth and a cycle, a very productive cycle in soils. Now, carbon sequestration is quite a big term, really, and there's often a lot of confusion. So I've given you these definitions from Don et al. This was also done within part of this EJP soil project. And basically, carbon sequestration is the drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the soil. And then that leads to an increase in soil carbon. Yeah, and that is basically carbon sequestration. We have other things like soil organic loss mitigation, that's just preventing the loss of organic carbon. We have negative emissions, that's the net removal of CO2 of equivalent greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So sometimes what we can do, if we draw down carbon, we can actually also create problems with things like nitrous oxide emissions, which are more powerful greenhouse gases. And then we can get these negative emissions as well. So here it's just for you to have a very nice sort of like the definitions of carbon sequestration and carbon storage and carbon accrual. It's not as though I expect you to know them, but it's just nice to have so everybody's on the same page with these definitions. So we'd see this carbon drawdown we see from the data quite really strongly. This is in the northern hemisphere in Mauna Loa in Hawaii, and we see every year that the that we have this annual cycle of carbon dioxide as trees and plants and crops take up carbon, and then in the winter they release that carbon is released back, or the respiration still goes on, but that drawdown of carbon from photosynthesis isn't necessarily there. So the red line is the CO2 sort of is the sort of like the annual, not the, is the integrated monthly values, and the black line is the increase in CO2 from 2014 to 2018. So although we've got a net increase in CO2, we still see these seasonal cycles of uptake and uptake and release of CO2 due to the winter cycles are the peaks are here, and the summer cycles are the troughs, basically, because the plants are taking that CO2 for photosynthesis. The interesting thing is these cycles aren't as strong in the southern hemisphere, and the reason being is in the southern hemisphere we don't have as many trees, or we don't have as much land, so it's very much a different aspect. So as I said before, carbon storage is really, if production exceeds decomposition, we get a buildup of carbon in the soil. If production equals decomposition, we get an equilibrium, so we get a steady state. So we get it won't change that much. And if production is less than a decomposition, then we get a decline in soil carbon. And obviously in agriculture, this can be very different depending on which crops we use, etc. And we always think the thing is, often for carbon sequestration, we think really about forest lands and everything like that, but also soils and agricultural lands, we can really change their abilities to sequester carbon by using different management strategies. So come over here. And different soils, because of their history, they also have very different amounts of soil organic carbon. So here we've got a picture of where I'm from. We've got the UK. Oh, is that? Is that working? Can you see something there or not? No, obviously not. Oh, there it is. So here in the UK. Is that working? I don't know if it is. Oh, sorry. No, it's not working. Is it working now? Here in the UK, for example, this is all peatland. And peatland is something you know very well or it's in the UK, it's in Scotland. Peatland is something you know very well in Indonesia. Indonesia has also got amazing peatland. The peatlands, although they're very high, they're very acidic, they're very, very high in organic carbon, and they actually, I think it's something like they only take up 3.3% of the total land area globally, but they actually store 30% of the carbon. What you also see here is that we have in England, for example, in the agricultural land where we have high agricultural production, these peatlands, they're from a production point of view, they're very low in productivity because they're very acidic. Usually they're only grazed by sheep and cattle. And here also in Wales and the west of England. But however, all the productive soils are very low in soil organic carbon. They're interestingly enough, but that's just because of this peat aspect. So we generally have in the range of about 2 to 5% organic carbon in agricultural soils. Again, in Indonesia, we have these peatlands as well in Indonesia. But as I say, because they're so acidic, they're usually very difficult to manage in terms of production. So really, we should be preserving these peatlands just purely for carbon sequestration. Oh, where's that? I've got to get out of here. Okay, so oh dear, can you see that green mess on the? Do you still see a green bit on the
Yes.
slide? Oh, how do I get rid of that? Wait a sec. Maybe I have to rub it out. Yeah, there we go. A green scribble. So here where we can see the global distribution of organic carbon, we have, as I said, because of in the northern areas and in some of these central areas, because we have had very, very high rainfall, and actually rainfall or wetness tends to reduce the breakdown of organic carbon in soils. So when you have very wet conditions, one of the reasons being is that fungi, all the fungi are really good at producing enzymes which break down the organic matter. They're the ones that are really sort of accelerating the breakdown of organic matter, the mineralization of organic matter. And when those fungi, they really don't like it wet. Their enzymes are inhibited by wet conditions, and there's phenol oxidase is one of the major enzymes that really is an oxidative enzyme. It needs oxygen. So if there's no oxygen there, if the soils are wet, it won't break it down. And this is why we see in these upper echelons of the globe, we see very high organic matter, and also where we get very wet conditions here more in the equatorial regions, where again rainfall is high. Oh, where is it? So the next thing I'm going to talk about is nutrient delivery and why nutrient delivery is so important in soils. So basically, all organic matter comes into the soil, and the organic matter usually comes in very long chains. It usually is like chains of carbohydrates, chains of proteins. Think of it as big, long chains of organic matter, as we see here. And those long chains are very complex chemicals. And those long chains need to be broken down in the soil for the plants to be able to take those nutrients up. So for nitrogen, for example, usually all of the nitrogen, those long chains, all of the proteins, etc., eventually are mineralized to ammonium, this very small form. So they'll go from sort of long chain proteins or whatever to like peptides to then down to ammonium. So they'll be broken down in the process. And that process is driven by the bacteria and the fungi and the archaea in the soil. So they're all doing that. And how they do it is they do it through releasing enzymes, specific enzymes in the soil that break down the organic matter. And because they release those enzymes, they also can take energy from that process. So that's how they do it. So 80 to 90% of that breakdown of organic matter in the soil is driven by microbes, and then that's what's doing. So if you sterilize a soil, you'll get some breakdown of organic matter, but that will be really very low. It'll be about 10% of what we usually get if we add fungi and bacteria to the soil. So here what we see is that the plant, that delivery from the organic matter, so basically the organic matter is broken down. As I say, this is the mineralization process, so going from organic to mineral. The organic matter is broken down into ammonium initially, and then that ammonium could be nitrified in nitrification. And really, both ammonium and nitrate are the only forms of nitrogen the plant can take up. And the plant is so dependent on nitrogen or agricultural production. That's why we add nitrogen fertilizer. If we add organic fertilizer in terms of urea or in terms of ammonium or nitrate, we get really big increases in production, because usually in the soil it's very low levels. It's very low levels. So if we add it as a fertilizer, we get much higher production. Problem with if we add nitrate, especially in soils that are have very poor structure or very poor organic matter and very poor cation exchange capacity, is that nitrate can leach very rapidly out of the soil. So in tropical regions, for example, where you have really, really high rainfall and you have fairly poor soils, the nitrate is leached out. And so we really want ammonium sources as your source of a source of nitrogen in the system. Ideally, we want organic matter, the turnover of organic matter, because the nice thing about the turnover of organic matter, that it usually stays as ammonium long enough for the plant to be able to take up those nutrient sources. So this is an overview of this was an overview of the soil nitrogen cycle, and this is more the simplified version, really the bit that you're really interested in. So the area where we've got the ammonification and the nitrification, and just to remember that the plants can only take up that ammonium and nitrate. But the organic matter has to be broken down for this to happen. So organic matter, unless we add fertilizer, the organic matter is supplying the nutrients the whole time to the plant. So in the form of ammonium and nitrate, that organic matter mineralization. And that mineralization process, again, this is where it comes back. That mineralization process is really a balance, right? We want a high mineralization process to supply nutrients to the plant, but we also want to retain the organic matter formation. So if we have both really high, we want maximum productivity in terms of organic matter conservation, but also we want good mineralization in the soil. So it's a difficult one to get around. How long have I got? I've got 10 minutes or so, no? Oh, no, maybe even not. So why is the organic matter so important in the soil? Well, because the organic matter also has a really huge effect. It has like a sponge effect. The organic matter really supplies when we have rainfall, and when there's rainfall, it will hold the water. But it's not only the sponge effect. Here we can see that the more organic matter is, the more yield there is. This is a combined effect of both water, that the organic matter can hold water in the soil, but it's also the effect of the mineralization of the soil. The more organic matter you have, the more nutrient delivery there is. Okay. Now then we talk about water. Sorry. We talk about water regulation and purification, another function of the soil. So infiltration and percolation are really important aspects of the soil, because if we don't have those, then we get a lot of runoff and we get a lot of erosion. So healthy soils are porous soils that soak up, as I said, organic matter. With high organic matter, they'll soak up heavy rainfall rather than letting it wash over the surface. Also, with the high organic matter and some clay materials within your soil, you get a higher water holding capacity, and also organic matter will increase the water holding capacity. We want to mitigate sort of runoff or runoff or flooding events. So we want to reduce the surface runoff. We want to have at least as high an infiltration as possible. And one of the ways we can do this is to sort of promote aggregate stability. Now, aggregates are the conglomeration of small soil particles together in protected aggregates. And the higher the aggregate stability, the higher the less vulnerable the soils are to flooding and they will percolate more. So aggregate stability, the beauty of an aggregate is basically it's like it gives us the drainage that sand will give us, but that aggregate is actually really highly charged. So it will give us the water holding capacity, and usually the aggregates are made up of clay and silt, sometimes a bit of sand, but they will give us, but they act like a sand particle, giving us the drainage we need, but also that retention of moisture. So aggregates are really important. But the way, again, we know there's a very strong correlation between organic carbon and that aggregate stability as well. Actually, it's the next one. It's the next slide. So we can see here we have this aggregate stability and the soil organic carbon, because the soil organic carbon acts like a glue for the aggregates. It will glue the organic matter together with the clays and the silt particles. Also, the water holding capacity we can see here is increased with the amount of organic carbon we add. And here we've got, this is in German, but the Humusgehalt, if we're 3.5% of organic carbon usually gives us our maximum yield. It's very rare, though, that we see agricultural soils with 3.5% organic carbon, unless we have peat soils, etc. So that's a real sort of, like, for us, it's a bit of a golden window of golden opportunity. So purification in terms of from water, as we have, sorry. Yeah, the soil also, I mean, it will purify the water going through. Another function of the soils in agriculture, it will purify water going through. This is mainly due to pore sieving. So basically the size of the pores will sieve out many large molecules. We also have a chemical purification where we've got absorption or anion exchange or ion exchange onto the surfaces of the organic matter or the clays. We have some buffering, so that for example, we can neutralize acidity with reactions with things like calcium carbonates, for example, in the soil. Then we have this biological purification. So within the soil, there's huge amounts of microbes. If you think about a hectare of soil, which is 100 by 100 meters, usually there's about a cow's worth of microbes within the soil. So about a ton of microbes within the soil. In a good, healthy soil, there'll be about a ton of microbes in the soil. So if you think of that cow as that, the microbial biomass which will be below ground, it's quite amazing to think that it will be fungi, bacteria, viruses, etc. So, and those fungi and bacteria, they're really good at breaking down organic waste and organic pollutants and oil spills, pesticides. They will break them down very, very quickly into harmless substances. And this is basically due to the fact that they exude all these enzymes, and they will produce these enzymes. And then pathogen elimination. The soil is a sort of, as I say, it's an absolute zoo of a zoo of microbial life, and that microbial life, so pathogens really, because it's such a competitive environment, they can't really survive in that environment, so they're very outcompeted very quickly. So, and finally, we talk about, so I've only got like a few more slides. We'll talk about the habitat for soil biodiversity. The soil is an amazing habitat for soil biodiversity, basically because you just need to go about 2 meters and the soil can change, the soil microbiome can change really phenomenally. Also, but just sheer numbers game. We have about In 1 teaspoon of soil, there's about 10 million different microbes or 10 million bacteria. And that means there's a huge opportunity for diversity within those soils. Also, the whole fact that the soils are so different, in the topsoil, you have really high organic matter, in the subsoils, you have really low organic matter. That also creates those environments of differential environments also create differential diversities. So here we can see all the different biodiversity types within the soil. We have bacteria, we have fungi, and I'll just talk a little bit about those different types within the soil. So the fungal networks within the soil, there's no actual movement of fungi. They can grow, but they themselves, they can't actually move. So they transfer substrates, but they can transfer substrates. So a bit like our blood system, the fungi can transfer substrates around. So if there's an area where there's a high level, or they can sense there's a high level of nutrients that they can break down, they would transfer enzymes to that area and break down the nutrients in that area. The enzymes are capable of breaking down all known plant compounds. They're the only lignin degraders. They're very competitive at low pH, but they have no anaerobic metabolism. That's their main sort of negativity. And that's why we get higher levels of organic matter in higher areas of higher latitude. Mycorrhiza, these are fungal symbionts. They basically trade carbon for nutrients. They can play a role in decomposition and amino acid uptake. And basically, they're a whole different world of microbes, which I'm sure we'll learn about at one point. Not so important in agriculture, it must say, but they are quite important. Next is the bacteria and the fungi, the bacteria and the archaea. The archaea are very slow growing, but bacteria, and they're very ancient. Also not so important in agricultural systems, the archaea, but the bacteria are really important in agricultural systems. They have a very large surface to volume ratio because they're actually tiny. There's up to 2 tons of bacteria per hectare if you've got a really good soil, and maybe possibly a forestry soil. So I think that number comes from forestry. They've got a very functional constraint that everything has to come to them. So they're very static. There's some motile fungi, but very, very little. They have exoenzymes, and they're very dependent on water films to live in macropores, so they tend to live in those systems. Then we have a vast range of soil animals within the soil. We have the microfauna, which are up to 0.1 millimeter, so nematodes, protozoans, celiacs, amoeba, and mites. These tend to eat things like the bacteria. The thing is with the bacteria and the fungi is because they can't move, the bacteria and fungi, they don't use that much carbon. They don't respire that much carbon. But once you start moving, you need a lot more carbon. So you need to consume a lot more. With that consumption, you take in a lot more nitrogen. So for bacteria and fungi, the consumption of nitrogen is fairly low. And so they don't necessarily need to excrete it. But as you start to move, like a mite or a worm, you have to have a lot more carbon. So as you eat that carbon, you're also eating the nitrogen. So as you're eating the bacteria or the fungi, you're also eating the nitrogen that within those bacteria and fungi. So so the sort of motile or the moving organisms, they get an excess of nitrogen, and that excess of nitrogen they excrete, and they excrete that in an inorganic form of urea or urease or uric acid, and that's quickly broken down into ammonium or nitrate in the soil, and then the plants can take it up. So the whole process is very much a cycle, very much a nitrogen cycle. And then finally, we have some of the macrofauna. I mean, I think these are very different in Indonesia. It's a very, and I don't know, it would be quite nice to have a lecture on, I think you probably have termites, but I'm not, the earthworms, etc., aren't so important in Indonesia, I'm not sure. So the role of the soil fauna, they've got huge surface to, surf, no, wait, so I need to cut. Sorry, I just need to get. The role of the soil, they've got this huge surface area, as I say, they really accelerate all the processes in the soil. The microbes contain 70 to 80% of the labor. That means the sort of like, if you think about it, all the carbon and nitrogen is usually locked in these huge molecules, and the plants can't get at it. But the microbes actually, when they die or when they're eaten by, say, a nematode or something, or that nitrogen can be rapidly recycled back into the system. So the more microbes we have, usually the more fertile the soil is. We have variations in predation rate, rapidly altering this C to N turnover, as I say, because of the respiration of CO2. It's very quickly lost, and we get this excretion of nitrogen in motile organisms. Yeah, as I say, the soil animals have a higher respiration due to carbon demand and because of the movement, and therefore they excrete the excess available plant N, and which is available for them for plant uptake. I don't think we need this one because I think I've gone over time. So what are the different ways that we can put carbon into or we can increase the soil functions? Well, I think it all really comes down to increasing soil carbon. But if we want to increase many of the soil functions, one of the main management practices are all about really increasing soil carbon. So we can minimize soil disturbance, we can maintain, so that's things like no-till or low-till. Obviously, that comes with some caveats. We need to use either mechanical ways to control weeds, etc., or even chemical ways such as Roundup. We need to maintain living roots within the agricultural system for as long as possible. Best to keep the soil covered, so mulches, etc., are really, really good. Animal integration can be one way of increasing the soil carbon. We know that with animal integration, we know with grazing really promotes the below ground, that plants invest in below ground carbon, and that investment in below ground carbon is one of the ways that we can really increase soil carbon, basically because of this microbial pump. And finally, if we have diverse crop plants, we diversify plants a lot, we can also increase the soil organic carbon. And with that, even though I am 18 minutes overdue, I would like to say merci beaucoup. Thank you. Sorry, there's a few bit. I have a little bit of time for questions. We have to 5-10 minutes because the kids don't come till.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca, for very interesting talk about the soil function for agriculture. Now we have the Q&A session. We have around 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, I think we can have 10 minutes.
Okay. Please raise your hand or write your question in the chat box if you have any question for Rebecca.
There's no questions.
Yeah,
Oh yeah,
please, Axel.
There is Excel. Axel,
Axel.
not
Yeah.
Excel.
Axel, yeah. Okay.
Thank you for the thank you for the
Please,
Like
time and
Excel,
Axel.
yeah.
opportunity. Yeah. Let me introduce myself. My name is Axel Rodriguez. But before, thank you for the time and opportunity. I want to ask about the pathogens in biopurification. So it said that what if the soil that already contaminated by the pathogens, how the methods to cure the soil, but in the same time, the initial soil microbes does not get the effects. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it is often soil health is about trying to promote as much organic carbon and also other microbes. And the thing is, when we have high levels of organic diversity or microbial diversity, the chances of the pathogens sort of like outcompeting the inherent microbial biomass is much lower. We see this, I mean, it's interesting when we do things like when we're trying to inoculate, say, for example, with a rhizobium, for example, which is a nitrogen fixing bacteria. Actually, in really healthy soils, it's sometimes quite difficult because they're outcompeted very quickly in those soils, just because there's so much activity in the soil. And that diversity, it also, I mean, some of this is quite theoretical, but having a healthy soil that's really that has a really high level of microbial diversity, the idea is that should reduce the pathogenicity or of pathogenic organisms. I mean, I don't know if you're talking about a specific soil-borne pathogen. Are you? Were you thinking of a specific soil-borne pathogen?
Oh yeah. If I want to add a question, especially about the E. coli bacteria in the soils. Thank you.
Yeah, E. coli are one of those ones that they're so ubiquitous. They're so all over the place. It's very difficult. Yeah, but as I say before, the more activity and the more diversity we have, the greater chances that we should be able to suppress those species, and that all comes from a lot of it. It's a bit like the microbiome in the body. I mean, the soil microbiome is very, very similar in a lot of ways. It has a very similar function to the microbiome in the body. The more healthy your sort of gut bacteria is, the more resilient you are to incoming bacteria. Things like E. coli. The same in the soil. If you've only got a few bacteria that aren't out competing for resources, for place in the soil, etc., then it's likely that you will get pathogenicity, as if you have a very sort of like active and very diverse consortium of bacteria and fungi in the soil. They will quickly outcompete, or even, I mean, many of the bacteria and fungi produce sort of like defensive compounds against different bacteria and fungi, and it could easily be that they outcompete in that way, more active competition. I know it's sometimes very difficult to actually. One of the big problems is when we try and, I mean, my sister is a gardener, and she said in the past, I mean, they used to every year, they would in the greenhouse, they would clean the greenhouse with bleach, with basically chlorine, isn't it? Bleach, what you put down the toilet. I mean, these days we would just never even dream of doing that, because putting bleach on the soil, you kill off all the microbes and you kill off all the differences. So it's but things have changed quite a lot in that regard as well, how we view the soils as well. So, yep. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, that's it. My question. Thank you for the answers.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Axel, for the question. Now, is there any other question from the participant?
Oh, yeah, there's one
Yep.
from Fresher.
Resha Hanifah.
So, good afternoon, Miss and Mrs. and my friends. So, my name is Fresa Anastasia from Agriculture Engineering, and I have one question, just a little. We often see that earthworms emerge onto the surface after heavy rain and then die. Since earthworms incorporate organic matter into the soil and they incorporate organic matter into the soil and they created burrows. Could this mass migration and surface mortality actually reduce the stable carbon in the topsoil? And we know that the level of carbon in the topsoil is so many, just like the presentation from Miss Rebecca. Uh, is this could this mass migration and the surface mortality can reduce the stable carbon? This is my question, and thank you for the opportunities.
Okay. Yeah, well, I don't know the system so well, but what I would imagine is that this surface mortality, if they're dying, they will decompose there. The carbon, at least some of the carbon will be retained from the mass mortality. And maybe if you want to reduce, one of the reasons they're dying is either they're drowning or they're drying out when they reach the surface and they're just exhausted. And maybe again, this is where cover comes in and mulching, that if there's some cover and mulching, the temperatures aren't so high. That's also another factor, is temperatures really high at the surface, and it's not a usual temperature that earthworms are used to. And this natural death cycle is definitely part of the cycle of the soil. So I think, or nature generally, like in nature, usually about 80% of like the organisms die within really very short time period. It's only like 20% survive in nature. It's far more unlike in humans, hopefully, where we all survive to about a certain age. In nature, in fact, like 80% of the 80% of the organisms actually die within the first 20% of their lifetime. So I hope that answers your question. But an interesting question. It would be an interesting one to study.
Okay, thank you, Miss.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe from Bu Ase, do you want to add something?
I just want to say hello to Rebecca. Thank you very much
Nice to see
for
you.
your lecture today. This is very nice to our student to open their mindsets about the soil. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's lovely to see you again.
Now is like time is finished for our lecture today. I would like to say thank you very much for Rebecca for very interesting talk about the soil for agriculture. For the student, please stay in this meeting because we still have time for the presents. For Rebecca, thank you very much,
Thank
and
you.
I
Thank
hope
you. It's lovely
to
to see you
see
Thank you,
you
again.
soon
Rebecca.
again.
Yeah,
Have a
yeah. See you
nice
soon. Yeah,
day.
take care. Bye. Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.